Ever stop and think about what secrets might be locked away inside our own justice system? We think of courts as these open, public places where truth comes out. But there's this kind of hidden vault where some pretty crucial information gets locked away from all of us. Today, we're going to pry that vault open a little and explore the fight over what gets sealed and what gets seen.
It's a pretty wild question, isn't it? What's actually in there? We're not talking about national security secrets or anything like that. We're talking about details from civil lawsuits, disputes between companies, or maybe between you and a big corporation that have been intentionally, deliberately hidden from view. So what are these secrets, and why on earth are they being hidden?
Well, there's an official name for this whole thing: sealed records. And just look at that definition. These are court documents that a judge has specifically ordered to be hidden. And make no mistake, this isn't some clerical error or a file getting lost. It's a deliberate legal action. And believe me, it happens way more often than you might think. Okay, so to really get this, we have to start by understanding the argument for all this secrecy. Let's think of this as building the case for why you'd want a lock on that vault in the first place. It just seems totally backwards, right? A public court system hiding things from the public. But it turns out there are some very specific and sometimes very legitimate reasons why a judge might look at a situation and decide, yep, secrecy is the right call here.
So what are those reasons? Well, for one, a judge might seal records to protect a company's sensitive trade secrets, like a secret recipe or a proprietary design. Or it could be about safeguarding someone's deeply personal privacy, like their private medical history. Secrecy can also be absolutely vital for keeping people safe, like protecting witnesses or victims in a case. And, sometimes the promise of keeping things confidential can actually encourage the two sides to settle out of court, which can be faster and cheaper for everybody involved.
At the end of the day, the argument really boils down to this. Without the option for secrecy, some people might be too afraid to even seek justice in the first place. The fear is that the whole legal process could grind to a halt or just become totally unfair. So, from this point of view, confidentiality isn't a bug, it's a feature, a necessary tool.
But of course, that's only half the story, because for every strong argument for putting a lock on that vault, there is an equally powerful demand to find a key. And that brings us to the case for transparency.
The push for public access is really all about basic democratic principles. It's about the public's right to know what's going on in our courts. Transparency is what keeps judges and big corporations accountable for their actions. It lets journalists do their jobs and report on things that matter to all of us. And this is a big one. It can uncover information about serious dangers to public health and safety, stuff that's just sitting there, locked away in a lawsuit that could prevent real harm to people.
So right here, you can see the central conflict, this massive tug of war. On one side, you've got this need for secrecy to protect people and keep the system moving. And on the other, you have this demand for transparency to protect the public and keep our justice system open. These are two incredibly powerful ideas, and they're pulling in completely opposite directions.
So, who breaks the tie? When these two forces clash, who gets to decide what happens? Well, this is where we get to the court's incredible balancing act, where one single person essentially holds the key to that vault.
That's right. It all comes down to a judge. These massive legal fights erupt over whether or not to unseal these records, and it's a judge who has to sit there and weigh these two giant principles against each other. They have to decide if the public's right to see the evidence is more important than the original reasons for hiding it.
So how does a judge even make that call? Well, it's not just a gut feeling. There's actually a process. First, the legal starting point is always a presumption that the public should have access. The default is openness. From there, the side that wants secrecy has to make a really compelling case. And finally, the judge does that critical balancing act, weighing that need for privacy against the public's fundamental right to know.
Okay, I get it. This might all sound a little abstract, a bit like a dry legal debate. But the outcome of these fights has incredibly real consequences for all of us. So let's ask the most important question. What's inside that vault for you?
And this is where it really hits home. A decision made by one single judge in one quiet courtroom can create these massive ripples that affect the health, the safety, and even the finances of millions of people. People who never even knew that decision was being made. I mean, just think about what we're talking about here. That sealed evidence could be hiding information about a dangerously faulty product that's still on the shelves. It could be about a company knowingly polluting a town's water supply. We're talking about corporate misconduct and massive public safety risks. When this stuff stays hidden, dangerous patterns can continue for years, and tragedies that could have been prevented happen. Unsealing these records isn't just about some lofty ideal of transparency. It can literally save lives.
And so that leaves us with this final, really important question to think about. When we allow huge parts of our justice system to operate behind a locked door, we have to ask ourselves, what are we losing in the name of privacy? Is the price of that secrecy sometimes just too high?
All right, let's dive into a really powerful investigative tool that's used to uncover the truth, especially when things get complicated. Today, we're going to look at how financial records can tell a story, a really objective story, even when everyone's version of events is completely different.
I mean, that's the big question, right? It's the fundamental challenge for any investigator. When the whole point is to keep things hidden, when stories are all over the place, where do you even start to look for the truth? Well, it turns out the answer isn't always in what people say, but in what they spend.
You can think of a complex case like this as a giant puzzle, but a really frustrating one, where you don't have the picture on the box to guide you. A lot of the pieces are missing, and the ones you do have are deliberately hidden. The key is finding that one single piece that makes all the others start to click into place.
And in the investigations surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's operations, that crucial puzzle piece was the money trail. Suddenly, financial records gave investigators a kind of roadmap they could follow, and that's how they started to connect the dots and really understand the mechanics of the whole system.
So, what does following the money actually mean? Well, it's a real forensic technique. Investigators get meticulous, looking at every bank transfer, every payment, every little record to see where the money came from, where it went, and, this is the most important part, why. It's about letting the numbers tell their own story, a story of pure facts.
So how does this actually play out? Let's break it down. Investigators might start small, with just one single transaction, one payment. Then the real work begins. They try to link that specific payment to a real-world event, like a meeting. And once they have that link, they can use that financial fact to back up what a witness says, turning a personal story into hard, verifiable evidence.
Okay, so one transaction is just a clue. But here's where it gets really interesting. When investigators zoom out and look at hundreds of these transactions all at once, they start to see patterns. And it's those patterns that can reveal something much, much bigger, a systematic, organized operation.
So what did the data actually show? Well, investigators found these recurring payments, time and time again, made right after alleged encounters. They uncovered clear financial rewards for people who introduced someone new into the network. You see, this wasn't random at all. The patterns pointed to a clear system of recruitment and exploitation. And look, these weren't just theories. The July 2019 federal indictment specifically called out these payment patterns. They were cited as part of a documented system of trafficking and exploitation that allegedly took place between 2002 and 2005. So that financial trail, it gave these allegations a specific time frame and a solid, factual backbone.
This really gets to the heart of it all, this idea of corroboration. On one hand, you've got witness testimony. It's incredibly personal, it's powerful, but it's also subjective, it's someone's memory. But on the other hand, you have a financial record, and that's objective. It's got a timestamp, it's impartial data. And when those two things line up, the testimony becomes incredibly hard to dispute.
And this leads us to this other really powerful idea that came out of the investigation. The financial records themselves started to act like impartial, silent witnesses.
This quote from the source material just says it all, doesn't it? Think about it. A bank record can't be intimidated. It doesn't forget details, and it certainly can't be pressured into changing its story. It just states the facts. Money moved from point A to point B on this exact date at this exact time. These records create a factual narrative when all the other stories are in chaos.
And investigators didn't just stop at one type of record. No, they started layering them together to build a really comprehensive picture. For instance, they used bank transfers to show the patterns of payment. Then they'd overlay property records to pinpoint the exact locations where meetings were happening. They analyzed flight logs to understand the logistics of moving people between places like New York and the Caribbean. And they even traced money through offshore accounts to map out the entire financial network. So,
The final stage is taking all these different threads, the bank statements, the flight info, the testimonies, and weaving them all together to build one single, cohesive, and incredibly powerful legal case.
The technique they use for this is called cross-referencing, and this is where the evidence becomes almost undeniable. Imagine you can take a flight log showing someone flew to a specific island, a bank record showing they got a payment the very next day, and then a call record showing contact was made right before that flight. See, each piece of evidence makes the others stronger, and together they build this incredibly detailed and verified timeline of events.
And if you want the ultimate proof of just how crucial this all was, get this. These financial documents weren't just some background research notes. They became official, formal evidence filed in court. And they were filed by both the prosecution and the defense. That just goes to show you how absolutely central the money trail was to establishing the facts for the trial.
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here. First, financial records have the power to turn a personal story into objective evidence. Second, patterns hidden in those transactions can reveal a highly organized system at work. Third, cross-referencing all that data creates a unified story that's tough to argue with. And finally, and maybe most importantly, money always leaves a trail that can speak for itself, like a silent witness. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. In a world where almost every single transaction we make is digital, every tap of a card, every online purchase, every transfer, we're all creating this constant, detailed financial record of our lives. It really makes you stop and wonder, what story does our money tell about us?
All right, today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating. We're not just looking at a case, but at the silent witnesses left behind. You know, the digital echoes we all create. We're going to see exactly how investigators can take these scattered bits of data and weave them into a real, compelling story. So let's get right into it. So think about this for a second. This is the big challenge for any investigator, right? How do you tell a story when there's no one there to narrate it for you? When all you have are these disconnected pieces, a bit of data here, an image there, some logs over here, your entire job becomes this massive puzzle. You have to meticulously reconstruct a whole narrative from these silent, scattered fragments. Okay, so where do you even start with a puzzle like that? Well, you start by identifying the core pieces. We're talking about the actual tangible items, both physical and digital, that become the foundation, the very bedrock of the official investigation. And at the absolute heart of this particular evidence set, you find two really key things: hard drives and photographs seized by the FBI. And look, these are not just some minor details on a long list. They are a foundational pillar for the entire investigation. Now, this is where something really crucial happens. A simple hard drive, something most of us have, it gets transformed. In an investigation, it becomes what's officially called a digital device. And that's not just a fancy name change. It gives that hard drive a specific legal weight. It's now a formal piece of evidence that can be used in court to build a case and establish solid facts. So we know what they found. But the next big question is, what do these files actually do? How do they really function when you're trying to build a case literally from the ground up? This quote, this really says it all, doesn't it? These files can quietly tell a story no witness could fully reconstruct. Just let that sink in. I mean, human memory can be flawed, right? Witnesses can be unreliable, but digital records, they offer this silence and often totally unflinching narrative of what happened. So how do investigators actually put this data to work? Well, it's a pretty clear three-step process. First, they use it to reconstruct the narrative, to piece together the who, what, when, where. Then, step 2, they cross-reference other evidence. They use that digital trail to either confirm or challenge everything else they have. And finally, all of this gets woven together to build a broader archive, a massive, comprehensive case file that aims to tell the complete story. And that brings us to a really important point. These hard drives, these photos, they don't just exist in a vacuum. You have to see them as part of a much, much larger web, what you could almost call an ecosystem of evidence. And if you want to understand just how significant these digital files are, get this. They're categorized with the exact same level of importance as the infamous Black Book and the incredibly detailed flight logs. So these records aren't just some side dish. They are a main course, a core pillar of the entire investigation. And this is a great way to see how all those puzzle pieces snap together. You've got the hard drives and photos giving you a digital and visual record. Then there's the black book, which helps document a hidden network. The flight logs, they create a timeline of movement. And property records help establish a financial footprint. See? Each piece tells its own little story, but when you put them all together, they create this incredibly powerful, interconnected web of evidence. Okay, so as we start to wrap things up, what's the big picture? What's the ultimate takeaway from all this? Well, it really comes down to this idea of a lasting digital echo, the permanent, undeniable trail that our data leaves behind. So the bottom line is this: these digital files are absolutely vital, not just for what's on them, but for the role they play as supporting pillars for everything else. They are essential tools for cross-referencing, for validating the entire structure of an investigation. To put it simply, they make every other piece of evidence that much stronger. And that really brings us to one final big question. A question that goes way beyond just this one case, and honestly, right into our own lives. In a world where every single one of us is leaving this constant stream of digital footprints, what story is our data telling about us?
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a huge topic, those seized FBI hard drives. You've probably heard a ton about them, but we're going to go straight to the source material and figure out what their actual role in the investigation was.
So this is the big question, right? The one everyone wants an answer to. With all the headlines and speculation flying around, you're probably just wanting to know what was actually on those things. Let's see what the source material has to say.
Okay, and boom, right off the bat, we hit a really crucial point, and I want to be super clear about this. The source material for this explainer does not give us some detailed inventory or a list of the specific files on these hard drives.
Well, that kind of begs a much more interesting question, doesn't it? If we don't have a file list, what does the source tell us about their significance? I mean, why did both legal teams think these drives were so incredibly important to the whole case?
This is where things start to get really fascinating. Because, according to our source, the real value of all this evidence wasn't about any single blockbuster file. It was about its power when taken all together to tell a story.
I mean, just listen to that phrasing. That's what's so interesting. The source doesn't talk about the data like a boring list of facts. It describes it as a silent narrator, something that could quietly piece together a version of events that no single person, no witness, could ever fully remember or reconstruct on their own. It's all about building a whole story from thousands of tiny digital breadcrumbs.
So how in the world did investigators actually do that? Well, they followed this really clear, methodical process. First, they combed through the digital records to map out a timeline of what happened and when. Then, they took that timeline and cross-referenced it with all the other evidence they had. And finally, once all those pieces were connected, they could build a coherent narrative, a story.
And this slide really shows you how that cross-referencing worked. See, the hard drives weren't just this isolated island of information. No, they were more like the central hub, the sun, that everything else orbited. The data on them was the glue that connected everything else: physical photos, bank documents, the infamous black book, even the flight logs. It's what turned all these separate details into a connected web of evidence.
Okay, so the investigators have built this incredibly powerful story. But how did that actually translate to the courtroom? What was its official status when it was time for trial?
The source is crystal clear on this point. These devices weren't some minor detail or a footnote in the case. They were officially designated by the legal teams as a major category of evidence. That means they were seen as a foundational pillar for establishing the actual facts of the case.
But here's the part that's truly wild. It's the consensus. This wasn't something they fought over. Both sides, the prosecution and the defense attorneys, put the drives on their evidence lists. Both of them, working independently, came to the same conclusion. The data on these things could fundamentally change the outcome of the entire trial.
And all of this brings us to the real takeaway from this whole thing. It's about shifting our perspective, It's about how we think about what makes any piece of evidence important in the first place. So, you see, the crucial point is this. We started this whole explainer asking what was on the drives, but the source material actually guides us to a much deeper, more insightful answer. The real story here isn't about some sensational missing list of files. It's about understanding the meticulous, powerful process of how digital fragments are carefully woven together to tell a complete story.
So let's just quickly boil down the key lessons from the source here. Number one, digital evidence isn't just a list of items, it's used to build a narrative.
2, its importance is often measured by its function, how it connects all the other dots, not just its standalone content. And 3, understanding this whole process is your best tool for cutting through all the media noise and focusing on how a case like this is actually built from the ground up.
And that really just leaves us with one final, broader thought to chew on. This case is a huge, high-profile example, for sure. But it really shines a light on a modern truth that affects every single one of us. It forces us to stop and ask, in an age where so much of our life is being constantly recorded, what kind of story is our own digital data quietly?
Okay, today we're going to open up a document that was really never meant to see the light of day. It's known as the Ledger of Silence. And what's inside? Well, it's pretty chilling.
So let's start with a really uncomfortable question. What if silence had a price tag? I mean, really think about that. It's a heavy thought for sure, but it's right at the heart of the evidence we're about to dig into.
To even begin to answer that question, we have to start with the artifact itself, the physical proof that points to a deeply, deeply disturbing system. The documents themselves have this stark, almost clinical label: victim compensation records. That kind of formal language immediately hints at a process, a procedure for something that should be anything but.
So what did they find? Well, the core findings are simple and just deeply troubling. The records show direct cash payments were made to victims. But the timing, that's absolutely crucial. These payments always happened after what the documents vaguely and chillingly refer to only as encounters. And that one word, you can just feel it. It conceals a world of horror.
And here's the thing, the records don't just show what happened, but how. This wasn't just a series of random chaotic acts. No, this was a carefully designed payment system.
So how did it actually work? It wasn't just a simple handoff. Not at all. The records reveal a very deliberate, multi-step process that was clearly designed for a very specific and very sinister purpose. The mechanics of it were just coldly efficient. A 3-step process. First, the encounter. Then, step 2, an intermediary steps into the picture. And finally, step 3, a cash payment is delivered. The fact that there was a repeatable process at all is proof that this was an organized, calculated operation. Now, that second step, the intermediary, that is the absolute key to understanding this. An intermediary is just a go-between, right? But their purpose here is critical: to create distance. They are there to sever the link between whoever is providing the money and the person receiving it. It's a classic tool for creating deniability, for hiding the truth in plain sight.
And this calculated system, well, it led investigators to a pretty powerful theory about the real purpose behind all this money. I mean, what was really being bought and sold here?
And this is the question that just hangs over this entire investigation. What was the money really for? Was it some kind of quiet apology, a form of restitution, or was it something far, far more sinister? Investigators eventually landed on 2 potential and frankly equally grim theories. The first and most obvious is that the payments were simply to buy silence, hush money. But the second theory, it's even darker, that the money wasn't just to cover up the past, but to ensure participation in the future. The investigators' own conclusion, in their own words, was that this was, quote, a system to maintain silence or continued participation. Just let that sink in for a second. The money wasn't just about secrecy. It was about ensuring the entire cycle continued. Its ultimate function was total control. So this one ledger, it reveals this methodical system of control, designed from the ground up to operate in total darkness. And after uncovering it, we're left with one final haunting question. How many other ledgers just like it are still out there, just waiting to be opened? You ever wonder how a case that seems to have gone cold suddenly just blows wide open? Well, a lot of the time, the key isn't found in some big, dramatic raid. It's actually hidden in the quiet, meticulous pages of a civil lawsuit. And we're going to break down exactly how private, sworn testimony could become the legal key that unlocks a massive public investigation.
Right, so how does that even work? How does a private legal fight between a couple of people suddenly transform into a public blueprint for federal investigators? Let's dive in.
Okay, so it all comes down to one single pivotal moment: the unsealing of civil depositions from the Jufra versus Maxwell case. This was basically like flipping a giant light switch on in a room that had been pitch black for years.
Now, to really get why this was such a huge deal, we need to be clear on what a deposition actually is. It's sworn testimony that a witness gives before a trial even starts. And the most critical part? It's all done under oath, which means it carries the full weight of the law.
And just like that, with that one act of unsealing those documents, everything changed. The whole process of discovery, gathering evidence for a private lawsuit, was completely transformed. What was once private material suddenly became this incredible public resource for investigators. We're talking thousands and thousands of pages of sworn statements just handed to them.
So, what's the first huge thing that came out of all this? Well, these depositions lay bare the entire recruitment system. For the very first time, investigators weren't just looking at a handful of isolated individual claims. They could finally see a clear, repeatable pattern at work.
Yeah, when they looked at the testimony from all these different people, a really clear three-step process emerged. Step 1, it all started with this massage pretext, to make the initial contact seem totally legitimate. Step 2, it would then shift to peer-to-peer recruitment, using friends and acquaintances to bring others in. And then step 3, they'd use financial incentives to pay people to recruit their peers, which just kept the whole cycle churning.
And look, this was anything but random. It was highly organized. Investigators quickly figured out they were looking at what's been described as a pyramid style of recruitment, a structured, top-down system that was literally built to expand.
And the sheer amount of evidence was just staggering. We're talking thousands of pages, and across all of them, the same exact details kept popping up over and over again. The same instructions, the same patterns of behavior. And that kind of repetition, it becomes undeniable proof of a systematic, coordinated operation.
Okay, but it wasn't just about recruitment. The depositions also started to unlock the nuts and bolts of the whole operation, the logistics. And a ton of this critical info came from a source you might not expect, staff members who weren't victims themselves.
Just think about that for a second. All of a sudden, investigators have sworn testimony from pilots, from drivers, from household staff. Now, these people weren't the victims, but they were witnesses. They saw the day-to-day workings of everything. Their testimony brought a whole new crucial dimension of the case.
And what did they give investigators? The hard facts. We're talking visitor schedules, records of who is coming and going from properties, detailed travel and transportation arrangements. All this data allowed investigators to start piecing together timelines and movements with a level of precision they just didn't have before.
Right, and this brings us to what might be the single most powerful thing these depositions did. They allowed investigators to connect the human stories to the cold, hard data. This is the power of corroboration. And in any investigation, it's an absolute game changer. It's when one piece of evidence perfectly confirms another. So here's the magic of it. You can literally put these two things side by side. On one hand, you have a sworn account from a person describing a specific flight. On the other, you have the actual flight logs from that plane. And they match. You have testimony about payments being made, and boom, you can pull the bank records that show those exact transactions. Each piece of evidence just makes the other one stronger.
And that right there is the key takeaway. These depositions provided the essential human context that the raw data was missing. Think about it. A flight log is just a bunch of numbers, right? Dates, times, coordinates. But when you have sworn testimony that explains who was on that flight and why they were going there, well, suddenly that data has a story. It has meaning.
So, what was the ultimate result of all this? The entire investigation was completely transformed. It wasn't just about looking at individual acts anymore. The goal became much, much bigger, to understand and address a whole complex, functioning organization.
There's actually a line from the analysis that just nails it. It says, this new evidence forced the investigation to address the broader logistical and financial infrastructure. I mean, at that point, they had no choice. They had to look at the entire machine, not just a few of its individual parts. And all of this really leaves us with one big, crucial question to think about. Looking beyond just this specific case, what does it tell us about the power of transparency in our justice system? It's a pretty powerful reminder of how opening up documents in one area can be the very thing that unlocks justice in another, shining a bright light into some very dark corners.
Hey, if you're fascinated by real investigations, hidden evidence, and the stories behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe to Crime Evidence Files. Every week we uncover new case files, interrogation tapes, and courtroom revelations that most people never see. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case. Click the next video to uncover more investigation files together.